We haven't talked too much about vectors yet, and they can be very useful if you have a use for them, but I think by default I would recommend not using them unless you do have a specific purpose because although they do have some benefits, they also have some drawbacks. So let's just take a look at how they work. And we've been making our layers as raster layers, but we can just as easily make a vector layer right next to it. New vector layer, click on that. And you can see it looks a little different, but essentially it behaves in the same way for the most part. But if I put some ink down and just draw some ink, basically there's some big differences now. When I press O to select this as an object and click on it, we get a ton of vector points that we can manipulate all we want, which are, this may be a level of control that you want. So this is kind of neat. But keep in mind, in being able to do this, this is going to use more processing and take up a larger file size. So that is something to consider as well. So that is one of the differences in vectors. Another difference is that on the vector layer, you cannot use your fill tool. So if we go to the fill tool, it will just give you this no symbol for saying that you cannot do any fills on the vector layer. You can do it on the other layer just fine though. So if you do want to fill in around a vector layer, that's just as possible. Another difference is if I were to resize this, let's resize it to, let's just edit with the scale up, scale down, rotate. And I want to make this quite larger. Now normally if I were to make something this large, it would pixelate if I did it with a raster layer, but I'm going to hit enter and it actually doesn't pixelate at all. And that's because this is a vector layer and it's not being determined by the pixels, it's being determined by the shape of those anchor points in the vector itself. So that is a very big difference, and this is like one of the key uses of vectors. If you're not sure how something is going to be sized, or if you're going to need to like supersize it for a poster or something, then you might well be justified in using vectors. So keep that in mind as well. When you erase a vector layer, it also behaves a little differently. You have a vector eraser, which if you like erase part of it, it can erase the entire thing. So I'm going to undo that. You may want to use one of the other erasers. And if you erase, even with this, though, it may erase a little differently. It kind of chops into things and kind of rewrites them a little. So this is probably the largest reason that I don't use vectors is because the lines just behave a little wonky because they are responding to those vector points. And if you chop too many of them away, it just has to kind of restructure itself to the remaining points. So that is also something to consider when using vectors. But that being said, you can use your transparent pixels and it'll also do something similar. But if you do want to like just hide this and kind of have it erased in a similar way to what we did before, we can always just create a layer above it and either use white or a transparency or some kind of masking or that we can hide this somehow. We don't have to necessarily use an eraser, but just want to keep that in mind that we may have to use a workaround to work with these vector layers.